SABC, host broadcaster of the G20 South Africa 2025.
All right, now it's exactly 4 days to the G20 Leaders Summit. Now for more, I'm joined in studio by SABC News correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease. Good afternoon, Sherwin. We've just shown those visuals of the leaders of the G20 member state. And of course, we do know that some of them will not be in attendance, the most conspicuous absence being that of Donald Trump, but we'll speak about that a bit later on. But with just 4 days to go, let's start with the significance of this summit for South Africa, for the continent and the global South.
It's the first time that the G20 Leaders Summit, the G20 Summit writ large, right, all of 130 plus meetings have been hosted in Africa by an African state. It is the first time, Mfundo, that the African Union will be participating as a full member, akin to what you have seen the EU do over many, many years now. So this is a historic summit at the tip of Africa, and you know, there's no bones about that. You know, the world's attention will be on South Africa. And remember what South Africa has sought to engender in this summit. It is a continuation of the agenda, the development agenda, the priorities in terms of the sustainable development goals that started in Indonesia, was taken up by India, then Brazil, and now South Africa. So this is a full circle moment. The question then does become, with the strong development focus, what happens when you pass the gavel from Pretoria to Washington? That remains the big question. How will the United States try to set itself apart from some of the decisions that will be happening, you know, certainly that started in Indonesia, and that will you know, certainly reach its culmination come the Leaders Summit at the weekend here in Nasrec, Johannesburg.
You raise a very pertinent question when you talk about what becomes the agenda of America when they take over their presidency, because we have seen this progression to some sort of an elevation of the developmental agenda coming from a forum that was essentially meant for global economic cooperation here. But you've seen this progression as you narrated. So what does become some sort of an agenda for America, or is it a situation where many other of those member states will circumvent and almost say America will do what it wants with its year, and then beyond that we continue with our developmental agenda?
I mean, if you take the United States broadly, Mfundo, I think what we've seen since Donald Trump's re-emergence as the head of state, he's returned to the White House, you know, he's told us what his philosophy is. It's an America first perspective. You know, America first, America's unilateralism in terms of reciprocal tariffs, in terms of how it has engaged in resolving conflicts around the world. It has not been through the multilateral process necessarily. It has been the United States going it alone, and they have the capacity to do that. So one imagines that that will be kind of the agenda, and America first that benefits America even as they engage and host in the G20 Summit next year. How they will set themselves apart is exactly what they've said. They do not believe, they do no longer assert the development agenda. The United States has been very clear. They do not support the 2030 development agenda. That is essentially the blueprint for how we get humanity back on track, essentially the cornerstone of the United Nations agenda. So you will see great engagement from the United Nations. The Secretary General is coming. He's come before. The Deputy Secretary General has been here for a number of the finance ministers meeting, the foreign ministers meetings. And so you're going to see the United States try to move away from this development focus, things around food security, disaster resilience, a just transition in terms of climate change, beneficiation in terms of critical minerals, to a more focused agenda on how to keep the global economy stable, essentially looking at macroeconomic policy policy writ large, but not focusing on what it sees as divisive issues, things like solidarity, equality and sustainability, essentially the theme that South Africa has adopted for this. And that speaks more broadly about how the United States is seeking to disassociate itself from the broad development agenda that is central to what the UN is about today.
So most certainly, if we're talking about movements that are anti-globalization or ones that are proponents of protectionism, most certainly it seems they would be quite pleased with whatever becomes the priority for America. But if we bring it back home, talking about solidarity, equality and sustainability, some of the main priorities with the 2025 presidency of South Africa has been reform. That we're talking about the cost of capital. We've heard Ronald Lamula, as DROCA minister, for the longest time saying they're going to push this agenda for developing countries, that the cost of capital, you're finding a lot of these developing countries having to spend a great significant amount of their GDP on servicing debt. And we've got the IMF that will be represented at the Leaders Summit. So most certainly their role at this point must start being felt if constantly they are invitees, but we're still not seeing those reforms.
And this is why a central theme of this G20 Leaders Summit, and really what the United Nations has been working on now for a very long time, is what the Secretary General calls the reform of the international financial architecture. How does the IMF and the World Bank engage with countries around the world? You're going to hear terminology called concessional financing. What does that actually mean? Concessional financing is getting money at concessional rates below perhaps what you would get from the private sector, from a bank, for example. And so development banks and their role in closing the the annual $4 trillion gap in terms of closing the gap in terms of SDG implementation, they have a very big role to play. You mentioned the IMF. When you talk about global financial stability, the IMF essentially is that is the IMF's mandate. When you talk about development issues, concessional financing, that essentially is what the World Bank does. Their focus is on the development issues, on the reduction of poverty, building capacity, for example, in municipalities. They just extended a new finance facility for various metropolitan areas in South Africa. I know Buffalo City is among them and others. And so it's very much a development focus there. The question you're asking is, to what extent are they succeeding? And certainly from the UN perspective, and those certainly within the South African geopolitical realm, it's not happening fast enough. So we have to watch very carefully what are going to be the tangible results from those two entities being part of that roundtable later this week.
And then what becomes the more contentious issues here? Pardon me, I see that on the corner of my eye there, Sherwin, welcome to South Africa. There's quite a lot of stories that we are monitoring.